Hi class, in this last video we're going to talk about violence in mass media and then ways to reduce violence. There is a relationship between watching violence and being more aggressive. There's a stronger relationship between actively playing violent video games and acting in a more violent way. In a meta-analysis that was done with looking at 98 studies that had 37,000 participants, they found that both violent video games as well as pro-social video games had direct effects on their players. The people who were playing more violent video games were acting more violently. The people who were playing pro-social video games were acting less violently. In a longitudinal study, which helps figure out what a steady diet of violent media can do, they found that there are lots of factors that can go into play to help mitigate or enhance the effects of media violence. In this one, they looked at 430 kids from 3rd grade through 5th grade. And they measured verbal, relational, and physical aggression. They also measured their exposure to violence in TV, movies, and video games, and how much aggressive behavior and pro-social behaviors they had twice a year using interviews and observations. They found that kids' consumption of media violence earlier in the school year predicted higher rates of all three kinds of aggression: verbal, relational, and physical, as well as less pro-social behavior later in the year. So my question for you, does this mean that you can say media violence causes aggressive behavior? No, because there could be confounding variables that affect both. If all you have done is a longitudinal study and not an experiment, you cannot say it is the media that caused the aggressive behavior. So if you do an experiment, a lab study, you can make that sort of a statement. So in a lab study they looked at the link between temperament and exposure to violence. They had kids watch two videos. One had lots of police violence. Another was an exciting but non-violent video. And then afterwards, they played a game of floor hockey. The kids who watched the violent film had higher levels of aggression during the floor hockey game. But it was primarily in the kids who had been previously rated as aggressive by their teachers. If they had this predisposition to aggression, then the violent film had them act in a more violent way. Another factor with this violent media and aggression is desensitization. This is the process by which we become decreasingly distressed by seeing people hurt. Exposure to graphic depictions of violence can lead to this desensitization. In one experiment, they measured the physiological response of men while they watched a bloody boxing match. The participants who had watched a lot of violent TV in their daily lives seemed relatively indifferent to what was happening in the boxing ring, and they had less physiological response like excitement, anxiety, other forms of arousal. Physiologically, they responded less to the boxing match they were watching. This is basically psychic numbing. It might help protect us from feeling upset if we have to be exposed to lots of violence, but it also increases our indifference to real victims of violence and to those who actually need our help. So in the Bushman and Anderson experiment, what they did was they had participants play either violent or non-violent video games for 20 minutes. Then they filled out a long questionnaire. While they were filling out the questionnaire, the participants overheard a violent altercation in the next room. So it started with yelling, and then moved to shoving, and then became just like an all-out brawl. It ended with one guy leaving and the other yelling for help while complaining that his ankle hurt and he couldn't stand up. The people who had played the violent video game took 5 times longer to go and check on this person. They interpreted the incident as being less serious than the people who had played the non-violent video game. In a field study with this, participants who saw a violent movie took longer to help a woman struggling to pick up her crutches outside the movie theater compared to a control group that was still waiting in line to get in to watch the movie. So exposure to violent media desensitizes you to hurt in other people. And then finally, an experiment done in Britain, participants played a violent video game and other participants played a pro-social one or a neutral one. The ones who played the violent video game were more likely to say dehumanizing things about immigrants to Britain. They cared less about the plight these immigrants were going through and were just aggressive towards them instead. A related concept is hostile attribution bias. This is the tendency to interpret the ambiguous behavior of others in a hostile manner rather than giving them the benefit of the doubt. Basically, when you perform the same or a similar activity in a lot of different contexts, like if you're playing a video game with lots of levels and you have to be violent in all of these different levels, it enhances or solidifies whatever concept you were learning in those levels, whatever behaviors you were practicing in those levels, and it maximizes that transfer of learning from one situation to another. So when you're put in a similar situation, it's more likely that's how you're going to respond. So for the Gentile and Gentile experiment, what they did was they found that kids who played a lot of different violent video games were more likely to develop this hostile attribution bias. They were also more likely to get into fights with their peers. And so, if someone just bumps into them in the hallway at school, they're going to interpret that ambiguous behavior as hostile. They'll get into a fight versus giving them the benefit of the doubt and blowing it off. Public fear relates with this media consumption and violent behavior because researchers have found that our public fear of crime is directly statistically related to the amount of violence portrayed on primetime TV. If there is lots of violence on TV, we think there's a lot of violence in our societies. Even though it's TV, it's not actually real. Even after factoring in changes in the actual crime rates, people's perceptions of the crime rate fell and rose along with TV violence, not actual violence. Watching violence affects vulnerable viewers for 5 reasons. Number 1, it increases our physiological arousal. So you're stressed watching this and you're just thinking, I guess I'm really angry, rather than just stressed out. You'll act aggressively. 2, it triggers a tendency to imitate the hostile or violent characters, and so it weakens any inhibitions you might have had for that, like if they can do it, so can I. Number 3, it triggers underlying feelings of anger, fear, and frustration while you watch this. Like, I better get him before he gets me kind of a thing. Number 4, it promotes that psychological numbing and reduces empathy. And finally, it models approved ways of behaving when we're frustrated, angry, or hurt. Like, this is basically how you're supposed to act. That's social learning. And let's talk about, well, hold on. Before we get to that, let's move on to an example of aggression that is common on college campuses, which is sexual assault. When we are talking about sexual assault, rape is a form of sexual assault, but sexual assault is not necessarily rape. Rape is the penetration of any bodily orifice with any part of the body or with any object without the consent of the victim. Sexual assault is broader than that. It involves any unwanted sexual contact. And sexual assault can be fairly common on college campuses. Some men rape or sexually assault women in order to try to dominate them, humiliate them, punish the victims. It's more about power than it is about sexual desire. That's why you see rape often used as a weapon of war. For example, in Russia or Ukraine, you saw that it was very common in the Rwandan genocide. They intentionally raped women, one, to try to give them AIDS, and then two, to try to impregnate them so that they would carry the children of the other ethnic group. You saw this in Bosnia as well, raping Muslim women. So it's used to try to dominate other people. You'll also see this like in prison sometimes. It's used for domination, or in youth gangs where they will rape rival members to show their dominance. Some rapes are committed by people who are violent strangers or serial predators. However, about 85% of all rapes are done by an acquaintance, someone that the victim knows. And this can be either done through physical force, so actual violence or threatened violence, but it can also be done through incapacitation. The victim is induced to black out, they are drunk or drugged and unable to consent, or passed out when the attack occurs. One factor that contributes to sexual assaults on campus is sexual scripts. Sexual scripts are implicit rules that specify proper sexual behavior for a person in a given situation. It varies with the person's gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and peer group. And so, one question I have for you: can you think of a sexual script? This is the way you are supposed to behave at McDaniel sexually. What is a sexual script at McDaniel? Okay, so for sexual scripts, how they relate to sexual assaults, some of the ones that can contribute to an increase in sexual assaults are things like women are supposed to resist sexual advances. And so if a woman doesn't want to resist, potentially, she might consume alcohol to give her an excuse, maybe even that think drink effect, if they aren't actually drunk, like, oh, I'm too tipsy to be really forceful in saying no. The problem is if they get too drunk that they really are too tipsy to say no, they are too drunk to give consent, and then it turns into a sexual assault. Combined with that, you have the sexual script that men are supposed to persist. Even if a woman says no, can you get her to a maybe? Can you get her to a yes? Keep asking. So if women are having trouble saying no, and the men want to think that a no means maybe, that can lead to assault. You have the sexual script that women are supposed to be nice. They're not supposed to offend someone, be really blunt in saying no to them. So you have to say no without really saying it, finding subtle ways to do it. But men, another sexual script, they're motivated to overinterpret a woman's nonverbal actions as signs of interest rather than just friendliness. And especially if the man has been drinking as well, he's not picking up on the subtleties if she's trying to subtly say no to not get him angry, he's not going to notice that, and he's going to interpret everything as consent to justify his persistence, even if it is not consent. So this is what Davis calls the dance of ambiguity, where you have indirect communication about sexual interest and intentions that protects the parties. His ego is protected when she says no. If she's saying it subtly, she can accept without having to explicitly admit she wants it. But if she doesn't actually want it, then it can lead to this honest false testimony, what Loftus and Davis call honest false testimony. The woman thinks she has said no, following the script she was supposed to. The man thinks she gave consent, following the scripts he thought he was supposed to. But that misalignment leads to a crime. It leads to that sexual assault. And so ways to reduce this on college campuses is to be explicit about it. Like a lot of schools now, I think McDaniel as well, as part of orientation, are talking about explicit consent. Having both sexes understand the rules clearly to decide if they want to follow them or resist. Have both sexes make sure they are following a script that's in the same play. Have women learn that it's okay to be explicit in what they want. Teach heterosexual men that they, or not just heterosexual men, that they need to interpret the signs accurately. And if someone is incapacitated because they are drunk, they cannot consent. And so sexual activity should not be taking place. It's immoral, it's illegal. So creating healthy sexual scripts is one way to help reduce this form of aggression, sexual assault on campuses. Other ways to reduce violence and aggression. Question for you. Does prison decrease aggression? So if you give people long prison sentences for aggressive behavior, does it decrease the chance other people will commit those same aggressive behaviors because they don't want that same prison sentence? No, prisons don't deter crime among people in the community or among the inmates once they're released. Punishing people with prison is not going to make them less aggressive. How do we know this? Florida had a large group of inmates who were unexpectedly released early from prison after a Supreme Court ruling. Basically, they hadn't had appropriate counsel. So they didn't know it was coming, they just got released. They compared their recidivism rate, how likely they were to be aggressive again, to people who had completed their full sentences. Those who did their full sentence were twice as likely to return to prison. Prison was not a good way to reduce the chance of aggression. It increased the chance of aggression. Next question for you. Does, and you should know the answer for this by this point, does the threat of harsh punishment help decrease aggression? No, it does not. What we have found, for example, states with the death penalty have a higher murder rate than states that don't have the death penalty. This threat of a really harsh punishment does not decrease the chance of you committing a crime that leads to that severe punishment. Severe punishment, if administered promptly, can result in compliance. So think like spanking a child, but it doesn't lead to internalization. It doesn't lead to them not doing that behavior when that person punishing them is no longer around. So think back to the experiments on compliance, identification, internalization, and chapter 3 with the threat of mild punishment versus severe punishment. Severe punishment does not work. A Norwegian study that studied bullying on the playground found that it decreased by as much as 50% if the teachers who saw it gave a swift but moderate punishment when they saw the bullying happen, not a severe punishment. Next question. There's this common assumption that kids will be less aggressive if they see an aggressive model punished. So if they see a model act aggressively and then get in trouble for it, it makes it less likely the kid will be aggressive. Is that true? Research shows that no, that is not true. In experiments where a kid saw an aggressive person who was either rewarded or punished, the results showed that if they saw an aggressive person rewarded, it increased their aggressive behavior. But if they saw the aggressive person punished, it didn't affect their aggressive levels. They acted the same as a control group. So seeing someone behave aggressively but get punished for it doesn't increase your aggression, but it also doesn't make you less aggressive. You're the same as if you'd never seen them be aggressive in the first place. Next question. What about if you reward alternatives to aggression? Does it work to ignore kids when they act aggressively, but reward them when they act peacefully? Yes, this works. In an experiment done by Brown and Elliott, what they did was they had nursery school teachers who were taught to ignore aggressive acts, but to be very attentive to the kids who were being pro-social, playing nicely, being friendly, sharing toys, that sort of thing. After a few weeks, there was a noticeable decline in aggressive behavior at the school. In an experiment done by Davids, what they found was they put kids in 4 groups. One group was rewarded for cooperative play. One was rewarded for aggressive or competitive play. And then the groups played each other. So 2 aggressive groups together, 2 cooperative groups together, aggressive and cooperative group together. They played each other they didn't play each other. This was not the floor hockey thing. They were put for a movie. Like they were told, you get to watch a movie, sit down here, have some popcorn, have some candy. And then they said, never mind, we changed our mind. They took the candy, popcorn away, turned the movie off. Then the kids all got to play together. And that's when they paired up aggressive versus pro-social. And they watched how they played. The kids who had previously been rewarded for cooperative play were more constructive. They were less aggressive than the other groups, than the ones who had been rewarded for aggressive play. For models, since we know that it doesn't work to decrease the aggression if you punish a model for aggressive behavior, what about if you have non-aggressive models? To curb aggression, it's important to indicate it's inappropriate, but the best way to do that is to have people in situations that could lead to aggression, and then they choose pro-social behavior again. So for the Barron and Kempner experiment, they had participants who were insulted by a Confederate, and then the Confederate was shocked by someone else. There were 3 conditions. That other person either gave them a mild shock, a severe shock, or there was a control group. That group, the Confederate, wasn't shocked at all. After that, the actual participant also got to shock the Confederate. So my question for you is, out of those 3 groups, control group who never saw a shock, mild group, or severe group, put them in order. Which was the most aggressive group, which was the second most aggressive group, and what was the least aggressive group? So the people who saw the mild shock was the least aggressive group, Then it went to control group, and finally the most aggressive group was the severe shock group. So the people who saw pro-social behavior, hey, I have to shock you, but I'm gonna do it mildly, they were the least aggressive out of the groups. The people who didn't have a model, the control group, were more aggressive than that group. You can kind of see this as a form of conformity. When the situation is ambiguous, like, I have to shock this person, what am I supposed to do? You go with what you've seen. If you saw a mild shock, that's what you're gonna go with. Another really great way to decrease violence is by building empathy. So in this experiment, they had a car at a red light, and then the light turned green and the car did not move for 15 seconds, which is a really long time for a car to not move at a green light. About 90% of the drivers in the second car, the one behind the car that was not moving, honked in that 15 seconds. Honestly, I would too. If there was a pedestrian who walked between the first and second car while the light was red out of the road before it turned green, that did not affect aggression levels. 90% still honked as soon as it was green and the car wasn't moving. But if the pedestrian who walked between the cars while it was still red was on crutches, significantly less of them honked once the light turned green, even though the person on crutches was out of the road already. They felt bad for that person on crutches, and it made them more empathic towards the person in the car who was not moving when it was green. So empathy can help decrease aggression. In an experiment done by Hammack and Richardson, they found that, what they did was they told people that they had to give shocks to someone else. Some had learned to feel concern for the feelings of the other people. They'd heard some things about them that made them feel bad. They gave less severe shocks than the people who didn't hear that, and the people who were less empathic. And one final experiment that was done by Obuchi found that if the Confederate first disclosed something personal about themselves, opening the door for empathy, it led to a less severe shock. So if it was the person saying it about themselves, or if they just heard something sad about someone, in both of those scenarios, it increased empathy, decreased the chance they were going to be aggressive. And altruism, teaching altruism plays a part in this. Altruism is doing something for others even at the cost of their own immediate comfort and pleasure. There's a correlation between altruism, this pro-social behavior, and happiness. And so my question for you, what causes this link? Does happiness cause us to be altruistic, or does altruism cause us to be happier? It's the altruism that causes us to be happier. They randomly assigned people to either spend money on themselves or other people. The people who behaved altruistically, they had to spend money on other people, were happier at the end of the study than the people who spent the money on themselves. And then finally, mindfulness can help decrease aggression. When people practice mindfulness, it helps to reduce that reflexive, aggressive response when you have the perceived provocation or insult. It can help you sort of reflect, decide what you should do, and it makes you more likely you are going to respond in a less aggressive way. And so one technique you can use is to practice mindfulness if you find you tend to be a little more aggressive than you want to be. But that is it for this chapter.